How many years have you been brewing?
It's coming up 27 years, I think, yeah.
27 years. Here's the big question I have for a guy with 27 years of brewing. If you have a choice at home to ferment in any vessel of your liking, what are the kind of things you look for that will allow you to make a good beer?
Firstly, it's design of the fermenter is critical, and that's related to being able to clean and sanitise the fermenter. So any nooks and crannies or dead legs in it are not good because you can't clean those properly. So that's important. The second part of it is that it's probably big enough to suit your batch size, and thirdly, it would be around temperature control.
Now, there's a lot of technologies that's floating around. A lot of people are getting into the act of making stuff, or devices that can make beer. If I have to choose the kind of qualities you mentioned now, and I want to get going, I want to start brewing, what is my choice? What are my best choice here?
I believe as a starter, just investing small is worthwhile as well. You don't need to spend a lot to get yourself going, and it's not worth buying something like this if you're just going to find you do a couple of brews and that's it. So this is a great place to start. Like as you can see behind us here, we've got a number of these fermenters, and we use them routinely for trial fermentations. They work fine.
And that's something that we found surprising when we came here. We thought it was going to be a big lab with all these stainless and all the beautiful machinery that's up there. But you don't, I mean, for Blackrock, you just ferment in these things.
The critical thing about a fermentation using something like this is the fermentation process is exothermic, so it releases heat. So you need to maintain that heat somehow. And the way we do it here and using these plastic vessels is keep the room at a moderate temperature. We like to go for about 19 degrees.
So the ambient temperature is important, and which brings me to one of the more important factors people don't consider when they're fermenting is not so much the vessel, is how are you going to maintain that temperature control. Ambient temperature is obviously easy for us up in North America because we all have furnaces and temperature control in our houses. What do you do when you're in New Zealand?
So we're using a heat pump to maintain the temperature, heating or cooling as required. When you're dealing with a small batch like this, you can get away with it, like 20-litre batch. When you get larger batches, you have to get more sophisticated and have typically a glycol cooling unit that would have pulsed glycol supplied to the fermentation and control it, because the heat generation gets too much for an environmental control.
I'm going to throw the big curveball, which seems to be the latest trend and fashion. Pressure fermenting. If you ferment under pressure, people say it goes faster. Doesn't matter, you can run it higher.
Yes, yeah, that's all correct. So yeah, theoretically, you can run a fermentation higher temperature and still get a pretty drinkable beer out of it. It still has its upper limits around where that's realistic, but you know, late 20s and you can still get a good clean beer.
Awesome, that's good to know. What are my other choices of managing my temperature around the fermenters?
So, depending on the design of the fermenter, it ultimately comes down to jacketed fermenters where you've got a glycol supply onto them. That glycol typically runs anywhere less than 5 degrees and down to maybe -2 degrees, and you're pumping that through the jacket of the fermenter and keeping it down. That needs to be on a closed loop control on temperature.
Is it important to keep the temperature constant as opposed to because let's say sometimes I know my folks are putting it right next to the hot water tank in the cupboard, right. And in some of the warmer days it's going to go warmer. So but what is the impact of temperature fluctuation?
It's important that it is kept stable. So each yeast would have an optimal range, temperature range that you're meant to ferment to, and you need to keep it within that range ideally. So if you overcool a fermenter, you're going to end up with a sluggish fermentation. The rate of fermentation is going to drop away, may even stop. The other end of the equation is being too hot. You're going to have a very fast fermentation. That being the case, the yeast metabolism will change, and the yeast byproducts, the flavour compounds produced by the yeast, will change. So you'll get a different flavoured beer.
So it's important to make sure exactly what your yeast like. And that's the place that you
Correct.
need to keep your temperature.
Yeah, lager, ale yeast, so it's all that contrast. Ale is sort of around maybe 12 degrees, ale's closer to 20 degrees on average.
So it's almost more important, doesn't necessarily depend on the vessel you're using, but the fact that your temperature management is wherever you're going to go. And this is where we get sometimes a little confused, as well as when we're done our fermenting and we want a cold crash, we want to be able to clarify our beer. Would the fermenter go into the chiller?
Yes, that particular design has got an internal coil in it, and once again you can use a glycol bank, a cold glycol bank where you pump glycol through it and cool the fermentation.
You talk about this?
So yes, so we've got glycol supply in and out, and this cooling coil here will drop the temperature of the beer. You probably need to also have that particular fermenter insulated with a jacket on it as well.
Then it starts to get quite complicated. It becomes a lot of toys that you need to maintain and a lot of things you need to clean, as you say.
If you invest in the right technology, you can get consistent beer, and that's what we're looking for.
More consistency, and that means really managing the temperature pretty well. Now, last question. There's some really adventurous people. I won't name them. Some might refer to them as cowboys. They want to ferment in this. What would you advise? Because there's a difference between advice and recommending using a corny to do some of this fermenting and carbonation.
Right, so for a start with a corny, you've got a dip tube that runs right to the bottom. If you're using it for a fermenter, you need to shorten that. Secondly, on the gas outlet side, you may need a spunding valve or a vent valve when you're venting it. So you manage either have a controlled pressure throughout the fermentation or have it on continuous vent and pressurise it in the latter. So there's two ways of doing it. The first is to have a continuous pressure throughout the fermentation, and that's typically around 1.5 bar up to 2 bar, and that's maintained, and that's at about a fermentation temperature of about 18 degrees, and that should nicely carbonate your beer. Second option is to have your fermenter on continuous vent down to around about 4 Plato, 16 SG, and then close the vent valve off and use that remaining extract to produce CO2 and carbonate the beer. So
then you have carbonated beer, and will I be able in that case to also dispense then straight from here, or do you advise the transfer after that?
It's probably, if you're not going to move this and shake it up, you could dispense straight from it if you're going to drink that beer fairly quickly. I'd prefer myself to move it to another vessel. You've got your beer there sitting on yeast. It's dying, autolysing and releasing off flavours into the beer, so we don't want it sitting on that, so we really want to get it out of that vessel and into a nice, clean, sanitised keg. And serve it from there. That's
a simple way how you can do pressure fermenting, and you can do it all with black rock. And I like your suggestion of giving it some breathing space before you actually start carbonating. Yeah, they say that at the start of the fermentation there's a lot of unwanted volatiles coming off, things like flavour compounds you don't want in your beer, so it's best to vent those off, especially around sulphur compounds and the like, so get those off, vented, and then pressurise it in the latter stages. Latter stages, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Steve, I appreciate your advice, my friend. And I guess the bottom line really is a guy with your experience is still using a plastic bucket. So you made me think there. I appreciate it. Yeah. Really do. Yeah, thanks.